The Sunday dining room buzzed with the kind of comfortable chaos that comes with extended family gatherings. Cousins catching up, aunts debating recipes, the familiar soundtrack of people who've known each other their entire lives. I sat at the far end of the table, picking at my food, half listening to conversations that rarely included me anyway. Then my cousin's 7-year-old daughter bounded into the room, pigtails bouncing, and chirped with the innocent clarity that only children possess. "Hi, Shadow." The entire table went dead silent. 8 adults frozen mid-bite, forks suspended in air like someone had hit pause on the whole scene. Then came the nervous laughter, the quick sideways glances, the desperate scramble to pretend a child hadn't just revealed the family's most carefully guarded secret. "She means Niall," my sister Solène said quickly, her voice pitched too high, patting the girl's head with obvious panic. "Don't you, sweetheart? You mean Aunt Niall." But children don't invent nicknames out of thin air. They repeat what they hear whispered in kitchen corners, what adults say when they think little ears aren't listening, what becomes so commonplace that it slips out without thinking. My name is Niall. I'm 34 years old. And I finally learned what they called me when I wasn't around. I stayed quiet through the rest of that lunch, watching how every single person at that table suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. The little girl kept glancing at me, confused by the sudden tension she'd created with 2 simple words. Nobody bothered explaining to her why calling me Shadow was wrong, because it wasn't wrong. It was just honest. My cousin Sarah tried to smooth things over as we cleared the dishes. "I'm really sorry about that," she whispered, loading plates into the dishwasher with unnecessary force. "You know how kids are. They pick up on things and just say whatever pops into their heads." "Where exactly did she pick it up from?" I asked, my voice calm, curious even. Sarah's hands stilled on the plates. She looked uncomfortable, like she was weighing how much truth she could afford to tell. "Well, you know how Grandma Rosa sometimes refers to, look, it's not mean-spirited or anything. It's just, you know how you are. Quiet. Always kind of in the background during family stuff." Then she paused, and I could see the exact moment she decided to twist the knife a little deeper. Maybe she thought I needed to hear it, or maybe she just couldn't help herself. Actually, she told Emma that the Shadow doesn't really understand family dynamics. That's probably where she got it from. I smiled and nodded, the same pleasant expression I'd been wearing my entire life at these gatherings. Kids say the darndest things, don't they? But inside, something cold and crystalline had settled in my chest. Not anger, that would have been easier to process, easier to dismiss. This was recognition. The casual indifference my family had always shown me wasn't just thoughtless neglect. It had been categorized, labeled, given a name that they passed around like some kind of inside joke. It wasn't enough that they'd spent years erasing me from conversations, forgetting to invite me to important events, talking around me like I was furniture. Now they'd actually named the empty space I left behind, started remembering everything after that. Every dismissive comment that I'd told myself was just thoughtlessness. Every time they'd made plans without checking if I was available, then acted surprised when I couldn't accommodate their last-minute invitations. Every family photo where I stood slightly apart, every group conversation where my input was met with polite silence before someone changed the subject. Shadow is just another way of saying you never shine bright enough to matter, I realized as I drove home that evening. And they'd been saying it for years. The worst part wasn't even the name itself. It was how comfortable they all looked when it slipped out. How practiced their recovery was, like they'd been prepared for this moment, like they'd discussed what to do if their secret nickname ever got exposed. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long time, engine off, thinking about shadows. How they only exist because something else is blocking the light. How they follow you around, always present but never acknowledged. How they're completely dependent on the thing casting them, but what happens when the shadow decides to move on its own? That night, I started a notebook. every interaction, every slight, every moment when I'd been treated as background noise in my own family's story. Not for revenge, I wasn't angry enough for revenge. For clarity. For evidence. For the moment. When I might need to remember exactly how invisible they'd made me, because invisible people, I was beginning to understand, have certain advantages. They see things that visible people miss. They hear conversations that weren't meant for them. They watch patterns emerge that others are too busy participating in to notice, and when invisible people finally choose to act, nobody sees it coming. *3. Weeks after the shadow incident, Grandma Rosa called one of her family meetings at the old farmhouse. She was getting older, she announced, and it was time to discuss what would happen to the property that had been in our family for 3 generations. Everyone gathered in her living room on a crisp October afternoon, notebooks out, energy high. Ready to solve the problem of what to do with 47 acres of prime real estate that was becoming too expensive to maintain, Solène presented her vision first, complete with printed handouts and a PowerPoint presentation she'd obviously spent hours preparing. The front section would be perfect for an event venue, she explained, clicking through photos of similar properties. Rustic weddings are huge right now. We could host corporate retreats, family reunions, graduation parties. The profit margins are incredible if we do it right. Cale had done his homework too. He'd researched development options, contacted real estate attorneys, even gotten preliminary estimates from construction companies. Or we could lease the whole thing to a housing development company, he countered. One lump sum payment, no management headaches, no liability issues. Clean and simple. I listened to them debate for over an hour, zoning laws and profit projections and marketing strategies, waiting for the right moment to speak up. When the conversation finally lulled, I cleared my throat. What about sustainable tourism? I suggested. Community gardens, educational workshops, eco-friendly lodging. The land has those natural springs on the back 40, those heritage oak trees that are probably over 100 years old. We could create something that actually preserves what makes this place special while still generating income. The room went quiet. Not the shocked quiet from that Sunday lunch, this was different. This was dismissive quiet. The kind of silence that falls when adults are patiently waiting for a child to finish talking so they can get back to important matters. Why, Uncle Marcus actually chuckled. That's very idealistic, honey. You're good with words, not business plans, Solène said. Not unkindly, but with the sort of finality that suggested the conversation was over. This is about real money, not feel-good projects. Grandma Rosa looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never noticed before. Not just indifference, actual disappointment. You never really developed practical vision, did you, child? These are complicated financial decisions. Maybe it's better to leave this kind of planning to people who understand how money works. The dismissal stung, but what happened next was worse. I watched my cousin David, Sarah's husband, quietly writing down everything I'd just said. Not to support my idea or ask follow-up questions. To steal it. 2 days later, he posted on LinkedIn about his innovative ecotourism concept for rural property development. Word for word, my suggestions about heritage preservation and sustainable lodging. My idea about educational workshops and community gardens. Just with his name attached and no mention of where the concept had originated. Seeds grow better in darkness, I told myself as I screenshot his post. Nobody steps on what they can't see growing. But something else had happened during that meeting that none of them noticed. Grandma Rosa's attorney had been there, sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes for the estate planning discussion we were supposed to have afterward. When everyone else filed out to argue about Solène's catering timeline, he approached me. That was an interesting presentation, he said, adjusting his glasses. Very thoughtful approach to land use. I know some incubator programs that might be interested in that kind of comprehensive sustainability model. If you're serious about developing it further. I was serious. Just not with them. Within a week, I had meetings scheduled with 2 environmental nonprofits and a rural development foundation. Within a month, I had seed funding to pilot the exact program I'd described in Grandma Rosa's living room. Within 3 months, I was implementing it on leased land 2 counties over, building everything they'd dismissed as idealistic into a functioning model that was already attracting attention from agricultural colleges and tourism boards. I never mentioned where the idea had come from. I never brought up the family connection. I just built it, quietly and carefully, while they were busy arguing about wedding venue insurance policies and whether to install adequate parking for guest overflow. But I kept David's LinkedIn post. Printed it out, dated it, filed it away with the rest of my growing collection of evidence. Not for any legal purpose, the ideas were too general to claim ownership over. Just as a reminder of how little they thought of what I had to contribute. Sometimes the best revenge is simply proving them wrong. But sometimes it's proving them wrong while they're still trying to figure out why their own version failed. 6 months later, Solène and Cale moved forward with their event venue plan. They'd formed a partnership with external investors, rushed through the permit applications, and begun construction on what they were calling Heritage Oaks Wedding Barn. Apparently my suggestions about the heritage trees had been worth keeping. Even if my input hadn't been, they cut corners everywhere they could. Hired the cheapest contractor, skipped the environmental impact assessments that I'd mentioned were probably legally required, installed an electrical system that was just barely up to code. The grand opening was scheduled for peak wedding season. With 3 events already booked and deposits collected, the first wedding was a disaster that went viral on social media for all the wrong reasons. The industrial generator they'd installed to power the string lights and sound system overheated during the reception and caught fire, spreading to 3 of those 100-year-old heritage oak trees I'd specifically mentioned during our family meeting. A guest's drone captured the entire thing, the screaming, the scrambling, the bride's dress train catching sparks as she ran from the flames. The video was shared over 40,000 times with captions like "When you book the cheapest wedding venue and Heritage Oaks burns down its own heritage." The local news picked it up. The fire department issued citations. The insurance company launched an investigation, but that was just the beginning of their problems. The State Environmental Protection Agency had been monitoring the property ever since someone, they never found out who, filed a complaint about unauthorized construction near protected water sources. The heritage tree fire had drawn additional scrutiny to their permit applications, and investigators discovered that they'd violated about a dozen regulations during construction. The fine was catastrophic: $158,000 for unauthorized land modification, protected tree removal, and potential contamination of the spring water system that fed into a larger watershed. The venue business collapsed overnight. The investors pulled out. The contractor filed liens against the property. I was halfway around the world, leading my 3rd successful ecotourism workshop, when they remembered I existed. Not because they wanted to apologize or acknowledge that my original suggestions might have prevented their disaster. Because they needed something from me. "We really need to talk," Cale said when he finally reached me by phone, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There's been a complication with the property situation." When I returned home 2 weeks later, they were all waiting at the farmhouse. Not in the comfortable family meeting setup from 6 months earlier. This was different. They sat around Grandma Rosa's dining room table like they were attending a funeral, looking exhausted and desperate and significantly older than I remembered. "The thing is," Solène began carefully, "we need everyone in the family to sign off on any major financial restructuring, including you. The lawyers say that because of how Grandma Rosa set up the inheritance, we can't refinance or take out additional loans without unanimous family consent." I looked at the paperwork they'd prepared. Pages and pages of legal documents that would allow them to mortgage the property to cover the environmental fines, the cancelled wedding refunds, the contractor disputes, and the legal fees that were accumulating daily. My signature was the only thing standing between them and complete financial ruin. "This is a lot to process," I said, gathering up the documents. "I'm pretty busy with work right now. Can we schedule this conversation for when I get back from my next trip?" "When will that be?" Cale asked, and I could hear the edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "Hard to say," I replied. "Maybe a few months." I left for Costa Rica the next morning, where I was consulting on a sustainable tourism project that was already being studied as a model for rural economic development. 3 months turned into 4 when I was invited to present the program at an international conference. 4 months turned into 6 when I accepted a fellowship to adapt the model for communities in rural Colorado. "See?" I heard Cale say to Solène as I loaded my suitcase into the car. "When we actually need her, she disappears. Just like always. But shadows don't disappear. They just move to where the light can't reach them, making everything else darker in the process." While I was gone, something interesting happened. The former farmhand who'd been laid off when Grandma Rosa could no longer afford to maintain the property full-time reached out to me through LinkedIn. He'd heard about my project and wondered if there might be opportunities to get involved. "Funny thing," he mentioned during our phone call. "That whole idea you pitched to your family? It's becoming the gold standard for this kind of work. People are calling it revolutionary, the way you integrated environmental preservation with economic sustainability. Never seen anything like it." The idea they'd dismissed as idealistic was thriving. It was being replicated, studied, and celebrated. Just not on their land, and not with their names attached to it, and never mentioned that it had originally been intended for the very property they'd just turned into an environmental disaster zone. Some information is more powerful when it stays invisible. 10 years passed like a held breath, never went back to another family gathering. Not Christmas, not Easter, not birthday parties or graduation celebrations or wedding announcements. When invitations came, and they did come, sporadically, more out of obligation than genuine desire for my presence, I sent polite regrets and appropriate gifts. Always thoughtful, never excessive, perfectly cordial, and completely distant. The farmhouse had been refinanced twice during those 10 years. Solène and Cale's subsequent business ventures had failed one after another: a restaurant that closed within 18 months, an online boutique that never found its market, a consulting firm that dissolved when their primary client discovered they were billing for services they weren't qualified to provide. The property was bleeding money, mortgaged to its maximum value, and they'd aged in that particular way that comes from constant financial stress and the knowledge that every decision you've made has been wrong. Meanwhile, my original ecotourism concept had become a statewide reference point for rural development. 3 communities transformed, dozens of permanent jobs created, environmental restoration awards, partnerships with major universities, coverage in National Geographic and Smithsonian Magazine. I'd built everything I'd described in Grandma Rosa's living room that day, just not where they could benefit from it. The irony wasn't lost on me. They dismissed my vision as impractical, then spent a decade failing at practical approaches while my idealistic model was being studied by policymakers and replicated across the country. But I never mentioned the family connection in interviews. Never brought up the original property where the idea was born. In the stories that were written about my work, I was simply someone who'd always been passionate about sustainable development and had identified a gap in rural economic strategy. Clean, professional, completely disconnected from the people who'd taught me that my ideas weren't worth considering. Then the letter arrived, not from Solène or Cale or any of the family members who'd been directly involved in the venue disaster. This came from the City Planning Department, addressed to all property owners in the Heritage Oaks area. The municipality was exercising eminent domain to acquire portions of several properties for a new regional water treatment facility. Fair market compensation, the letter assured. Environmental impact assessments already completed. Construction timeline to begin within 18 months. But the sale required unanimous consent from all legal stakeholders in any multi-owner properties, and suddenly, the shadow they'd forgotten about was the only thing standing between them and complete financial collapse. The farmhouse property was still underwater financially. The mortgages and liens exceeded its current market value by nearly $200,000. But the city's offer was generous enough to not only clear all their debts but provide substantial additional compensation. It was, quite literally, their only chance to escape the financial quicksand they'd been sinking into for a decade, except they needed my signature. And I hadn't spoken to any of them in 10 years. The first contact came through a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd encouraged my original project, but a new firm that specialized in complex family financial situations. Very formal, very careful. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the property situation and mutual family interests. For the first time in a decade, they needed me. And for the first time in our entire relationship, they were asking politely. It takes 10 years for a shadow to become structural, I told myself as I read their formal meeting request. Now let's see them try to find light. The beautiful irony was that my project had grown beyond their wildest dreams, but it carried only Grandma Rosa's name. I'd established the Rosa Santos Memorial Learning Center as the flagship site, honoring the woman who'd owned the land even as she'd dismissed my vision for it. She'd died 5 years earlier, and they'd spent her final months arguing about money instead of visiting her bedside. Now they needed the signature of the granddaughter she'd called impractical. The one whose thrown-away idea had become everything they'd failed to build. Nothing moves here without the name you erased, I thought as I scheduled the meeting. How's that for practical vision? The meeting was held in the conference room of Patterson, Hayes & Associates, a downtown law firm with the kind of understated, expensive aesthetic that suggests serious money is at stake. Floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs, conference table that probably cost more than most people's cars. They were all there when I arrived. Solène and Cale, looking older and more worn than I remembered. My Uncle Marcus and Aunt Patricia. My cousin David and his wife Sarah, even a few distant relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. Everyone dressed carefully, everyone speaking in measured tones, everyone treating this like the delicate negotiation it had become. I was 15 minutes late, not intentionally, but I didn't apologize or explain. I simply took the seat at the far end of the table, opened my briefcase, and waited. The lawyer began with a formal presentation of the situation. The city's eminent domain claim, the financial obligations currently tied to the property, the timeline for decision-making, the consequences of not reaching an agreement. Professional. Thorough, careful not to pressure anyone while making it abundantly clear that this was their only viable option. Then he slid the document packet across the table to me. I read everything. Every clause, every subsection, every piece of fine print. The room was completely silent except for the sound of pages turning and the old clock on the wall marking time that they couldn't afford to waste. They waited. And waited. And waited. 47 minutes of complete silence while I reviewed documents that their lawyer had probably assumed I'd sign immediately. After all, what possible reason would I have to complicate a deal that benefited everyone? When I finally finished reading, I opened my pen and began making handwritten modifications to several sections. Crossing out clauses, initiating changes, adding notes in the margins. The sound of ink on paper was surprisingly loud in that quiet room. I signed some papers. Left others completely blank. Made conditional approvals on documents that had been intended as simple authorizations. When I finished, I closed my briefcase, stood up, and walked toward the door. "Wait," Solène said, her voice sharper than she'd probably intended. "What did you sign? What didn't you sign? We need to understand what just happened." I turned back to look at her. Really looked, for the first time in years. At the stress lines around her eyes, the gray threading through her hair, the way her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. "You erased me from the original plan," I said calmly. "Now you can read the fine print with my name on it." I walked out without another word. The modifications I'd made were surgically precise and absolutely devastating. Approved the sale of the front section to the city, the portion they needed for the water treatment facility. That would generate enough money to clear their debts and provide modest compensation to all family members. But the back 40 acres, the section with the natural springs, the heritage trees that hadn't burned, the most environmentally valuable and potentially profitable land, was now locked in a conservation trust for 25 years. No development, no sale, no modifications without approval from the trust's managing board, and I had listed myself as the trust's primary executor. The family would receive the immediate financial relief they desperately needed. But any future development of the property's most valuable section would require my explicit approval, and I'd structured the trust with environmental protection standards that were virtually impossible to meet for any commercial venture that prioritized profit over conservation. They were legally bound to accept my division of the property. The city's eminent domain claim provided the legal framework that made my modifications enforceable. They could take the deal I'd crafted, or they could lose everything to foreclosure within 6 months. "You trapped us here," Cale said when he called me 3 days later, his voice shaking with rage that had been building for years. "I didn't trap you," I replied, my voice completely calm. "I just returned the favor. You called me a shadow for years. Now you get to live in the darkness." But there was one more detail I hadn't mentioned. The conservation trust I'd established was structured so that any revenue generated from the protected land, research partnerships, educational programs, environmental restoration grants, would fund the Rosa Santos Memorial Environmental Education Program. Grandma Rosa's memory would be preserved and honored. Her name would be attached to groundbreaking environmental work that generated national recognition and academic partnerships, but the rest of the family's names weren't mentioned anywhere in the trust documentation. Not once. They'd spent a decade dismissing my vision as impractical idealism. Now they were legally obligated to watch me implement that exact vision on their own family property, generating the recognition and success they'd never believed was possible. The shadow they'd named had finally found a way to cast them into darkness. 2 years later, I was featured in a PBS documentary called Rural Visionaries: Women Transforming America's Heartland. 53 minutes of footage about innovative approaches to sustainable development, with my work highlighted as the centerpiece example of how environmental protection and economic growth could be successfully integrated. My family watched it. I know because Sarah called me afterward, the first direct contact any of them had initiated since the lawyer's office meeting. "We saw the documentary," she said, her voice careful and strange. "It was impressive. We had no idea your work had gotten so much attention." The program had shown everything they'd missed while they were avoiding me for 2 years. The Rosa Santos Memorial Environmental Education Program had become a model for rural conservation that was being replicated in 14 states. The original ecotourism concept I'd pitched in Grandma Rosa's living room was now being taught in graduate programs and cited in federal policy recommendations. The documentary included a segment filmed at the Conservation Trust site, the back 40 acres of their own family property that they couldn't touch without my permission. The cameras had captured the restored spring ecosystem, the educational pavilion built from reclaimed materials, the heritage oak grove that had been carefully preserved and integrated into the program design. But what had really gotten their attention was the commemorative plaque that had been installed at the main entrance. Large enough to be visible in the wide-angle shots, clear enough to be read by anyone who paused the video. Rosa Santos Memorial Learning Center here, once, the shadow planted hope. The documentary never mentioned my family by name. Never referenced the original property ownership or the history of the land use discussions. In the official story, I was simply an environmental innovator who had identified an underutilized rural property and developed a groundbreaking model for sustainable land management. Clean, professional, completely disconnected from the people who'd taught me that my ideas weren't worth hearing, but they knew. Sitting in Solen's living room, watching their own family land being celebrated on national television as an example of visionary environmental stewardship. They knew exactly where those ideas had come from and exactly why their names weren't being mentioned. "She's heartless," Solène had said afterward, according to Sarah. "Building her whole career on our family property and never acknowledging where she came from." But Marcus, the uncle who'd always stayed quiet during family arguments, had finally spoken up. "She did exactly what none of us had the vision to do," he'd said. "And she did it without needing us at all." The documentary had ended with footage of the newest project site, where my model was being adapted for a coalition of 6 rural communities. The closing shot showed me standing next to a sign that read "Future Home of the Heartland Sustainable Development Initiative," with rolling farmland stretching out behind me toward the horizon. The narrator's final words were, "Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the quietest voices." The challenge is learning to listen before it's too late. 3 months after the documentary aired, I received an invitation to present my work at the United Nations Climate Summit. 6 months after that, I was offered a position leading the new Federal Rural Sustainability Initiative. But I never received another call from my family. The shadow had grown too large for them to acknowledge, and too successful for them to dismiss. Some silences become louder than any words could ever be. I still receive Christmas cards from some of them. Careful, polite messages about hoping I'm well and staying busy. Pictures of children I barely know, updates about jobs and marriages and the ordinary progression of lives that continue whether I'm part of them or not. Send thank you notes back. Brief, cordial, completely empty of any real connection, but I don't visit. I don't call. I don't explain. The Conservation Trust has expanded to include properties in 4 states now. The educational programs have grown into a regional network that serves over 200 schools annually. Last month, we broke ground on the new climate research facility that will study sustainable agriculture techniques and train the next generation of environmental innovators. Y office overlooks the springs they'd wanted to fill in for a gravel parking lot. The family still owns the front section of the original property. They've managed to make it profitable, finally, by leasing it to a small organic farm collective that provides produce to local restaurants and farmers markets. Nothing glamorous or high profit, but sustainable and steady. Sometimes journalists ask me about the family connection to the land. I tell them it has an interesting history, that it took time for people to understand what it was meant to become. I mention that the previous generation had different ideas about land use, but that change often requires patience, and never mention that I was once invisible in that history. Or that invisible people, when they finally choose to move, can reshape everything they touch without anyone seeing it coming. The shadow they named me taught me something valuable about the nature of power. Real power isn't about being seen or acknowledged or included in decisions. Real power is about being essential when it matters most. It's about building something so significant that people have no choice but to recognize its value, even if they refuse to recognize yours. They gave me silence to diminish me. I used it to create space for something larger than anything they'd ever imagined. 10 years ago, they dismissed my vision as impractical idealism. Today, that vision employs over 400 people, generates millions in economic activity, and serves as the foundation for national policy initiatives. The shadow they created has cast influence across multiple states and into federal environmental planning, but the most satisfying part isn't the recognition or the success or even the validation of being proven right. The most satisfying part is the knowledge that I built all of this without needing them, without including them, and without ever having to explain myself. Stayed quiet for 34 years. They finally noticed what silence could accomplish. The Conservation Trust will outlive all of us. In 50 years, when people study the early foundations of sustainable rural development in America, they'll read about the Rosa Santos Memorial Environmental Education Program and the breakthrough work that started on a small property in the Midwest. Grandma Rosa's name will be remembered as part of something significant and lasting. But the family members who dismissed her granddaughter's vision? History has a way of forgetting people who never contributed anything worth remembering. Don't need their apologies or their acknowledgement or their belated understanding of what they lost when they decided I wasn't worth listening to. I have. The silence. And it's been more than enough. This reminded you of someone, maybe yourself. Remember that shadows exist because there's light somewhere. Sometimes you just have to choose where to cast it.